It's now been almost exactly 2 years and 2 months since the first chapter was released. It feels as though it was yesterday when it took over the community before that first chapter was released. Time is moving way too quickly. In less than 50 days it's going to be 2026, which I don't like. Anyway, it's 99 chapters later and the big 100 chapter milestone has been hit. Plenty of content to fairly judge the story, compare the story if that's what you want to do. But what is an undeniable fact, in my opinion, I know it's a contradiction to say my opinion is fact because it absolutely isn't. I just think the first 100 chapters of KAGURABACHI have been quality. All of the jokes and memes made about it leading up to and during its release, only for the series to turn our heads and say it has a real story that it wants to tell us. Truth be told, those memes were the reason I read it from week 1 chapter 1, which is a big thing for me because I usually won't pick up a newly debuting manga until it's near certain that it won't get axed, because I'm not a fan of that feeling of dissatisfaction that comes with a story being incomplete. But I think we're in the clear here. It's reached the level where it's beyond getting cut short by the magazine and then some. So here is the spoiler warning for everything up to and including chapter 100. Although I don't plan to deep dive into every part of the story, you may have guessed that from the runtime, into each of the arcs, which there are 3 of according to the wiki, but I'm sure people believe there are more. Anyway, I released a video last year which coincidentally I made right after the final chapter of the Rakuzaichi arc, chapter 44 of the manga, but in that video I'm also discussed KAGURABACHI's position going forward, its position in the magazine, the memes early on, its competition and so on, not really actually talking about the story. So with this video, 100 chapters in, I'm going to go chronologically through it and pick out the story beats that stood out to me the most. Although now that I am looking at each moment I picked, which there are 3 of, 1 for each arc, they all fall into one thematic category, family, which is fine because now this video has an identity. So with any story you're not gonna know how good it is from the first few chapters alone, but for me the first part of this series that really endeared me to it was the introduction of Cha, or Sha, I've always said Cha, and her relationship with Chihiro, because Chihiro, one of the main memes surrounding the series was his edginess with the line, "He wakes up every morning with fresh hatred," although to be fair that line, at least to me, showed the author being self-aware of his character's edge, and it was a joke not to be taken completely seriously. But you still have this guy, Blackfit, doesn't smile. There's bound to be story beats that will be designed to soften him up, take the edge off in a sense. That was clear for me firstly with Cha, and I am a sucker for familial relationships in storytelling. You could say that familial relationships make up the majority of relationships in shonen storytelling. The idea of family, and that is at its best when one or both of the characters in this relationship are made to change themselves, in a sense, come out of their shell. Chihiro has his cold, uninviting exterior, and yet, after being saved, Cha felt more comfortable with him. If you've ever heard the saying that children don't lie or they speak truthfully or openly, I can kind of see that here with Cha, where she could see that he had another side to him even though he wasn't willing to acknowledge that himself, or rather his way of acknowledging that side of himself was to push it down because he thought it had no use to him while being driven by revenge. And then he ended up becoming the dad who didn't want the new pet but ended up becoming the closest to it. And it's not like this bond came out of nowhere either. They both had lost their parents, which is what compelled Chihiro to take her out for food to begin with, and he's the only one who was able to get her to open up. Shared trauma that doesn't need to be explained between them, and you can look at Chihiro saving her again, Cha healing him, as some substantial moments that showcase their trust, brought them closer together. But I found that a specific quote from Gandalf, I know very random, but it's a quote that rings very true for me.
Saruman believes that it is only great power that can hold evil in check. But that is not what I have found. I found it is the small things, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keeps the darkness at bay. Simple acts of kindness and love.
In the context of Chihiro and Char, it's the little things that sell the legitimacy of this connection. Her wanting to be with him, giving her food, her sleeping, the big acts of courage are only worth it when you're able to enjoy the simpler things in life. Then we move forward to Hakuri suffered from some severe abuse and neglect as a kid growing up in a household who did not care for him, or at best it was superficial care, nothing but pain, brought up to believe he had no value because of his lack of sorcery, when in actual fact, even if his father Kyora did see some value in him, it would be value as a tool for his father's gains, thus the superficial feeling of a family. So if he was raised under the notion that his existence was practically pointless, there's no way he would have thought he was worth anything himself. So you can argue that feeling manifests itself in the form of him constantly getting hurt, because enter Chihiro in this case now. Their first meeting saw Hakuri taking a punch, Hiyuki's flamebone punch by the way, to the face because Chihiro hesitated, and it was that action which steeled Chihiro's resolve once again. He remembered it's not just revenge, his father also taught him to protect the weak, when in this scenario the weak protected him. And you know it's a big deal because we can bring in the fact that Hakuri failed to save that ice girl, which only compounded his feeling of worthlessness. And yet he still jumped in here, work our way through the Rakuzaichi arc, and it's clear that Chihiro helped him find out who he really is, reaffirming his identity. Because Hakuri said his father was always his North Star, one could argue that after Kyora's death, this title, this responsibility you could call it, of guiding Hakuri fell onto Chihiro's shoulders, the new North Star. But back to the Gandalf quote once again about the simpler things with Hakuri. He might have been the first guy Chihiro has gotten to know who's also the same age as him, so a normal friend. No disrespect to Shiba because we love Shiba, but he's really more of an uncle anyway. But the point still stands that Hakuri is most likely Chihiro's first true friend. And on the flip side, Chihiro was probably the first guy to treat Hakuri like a normal person, not like a tool or an object, but like a normal human being, a friend. And last but certainly not least, Samura, who is undeniably my favorite character in the whole story. We learn that the sins of his past have weighed heavily on his conscience since the war, a man who blinded himself to shield his eyes from the horror of the world and his own actions, but ironically can now only look back on and see the horror of his own past actions. They held him back so much that he couldn't even bear to hold his daughter, as to not dirty her with the blood on his hands, a gentle soul forced to become, in his own words as well, a monster for the people he cared for. But the grasp of this monster he believes himself to have become is strong enough that even though he did these things for the sake of others, he is unable to move forward with them because, and I don't mean to rip off Vinland Saga, but it is the perfect visual metaphor in this case as well, the hands of those he killed keep pulling him back. And enter not Chihiro for a change, but instead it's Samura's daughter Iori. But an important note here is that he didn't take the initiative to raise her on his own. His guilt would not allow that, so it had to be forced on him by Iori's mother Inori, who tells him to look forward, not back. This little girl is the family he fought to protect, if not for himself, move forward for her, so you don't drag her into the shadows of your own torment, of your own guilt, your own past. And for a start, he is able to do it. Things start to be changing. He seems to be letting go of the guilt ever so slightly before Yura starts playing his games, and Samura is pulled straight back into the deepest pits of his own mind, drowning in his guilt once again, back to square one, square zero even. This is worse than how he was before Iori, and this pain forces him to leave her, causing her pain, which causes him more guilt and only gives credence to his belief that she would be better off without him, which gives birth to this vicious cycle where he is just tearing himself apart. And we see him using his feelings and how he views himself as a monster to justify his actions with Chihiro and Uruha. They would not understand, and only he can carry this burden because he believes he's already destined for hell, so he'll commit these crimes to spare everyone else. And to Iori, she is in some senses an exact copy of her father in the way she has her own sense of self, how she tries to bear her own burden to spare him the vandalism, the trash, the bullying. She knew her father and the pain he carried with him wherever he went, so she tried to be strong enough to not add any more weight on his shoulders. It's the same cycle of taking on suffering for the sake of another, even though the other person wouldn't want them to. Even after everything else leading up to Iori gaining her memories and seeing her father again, he intentionally ignores her words, keeping his eyes closed in more ways than one. Another reason he would rather not see is because he knows it would weaken his own resolve. He is so far gone, he is so selfless that it's kind of done a 180 and became selfishness, where he rejects anything he cares for, including his own daughter. And here's where we can bring in Chihiro for the third time in this video. The lives of the young ones he's fighting so hard to protect are fighting back for themselves, because Samura has to learn that his past does not define him, and with his guilt carrying over to what he sees in the future, well, the future isn't written either, so why not, just as he advised Chihiro to do, live his own life? So this wasn't as much of a 100 chapter celebration as I had initially planned it to be, but maybe this was better. 100 chapters, 3 arcs, and each of these plot points I talked about are from each of those 3 arcs, so I guess that can act as the testament to the 100th chapter, that each of the arcs up to this milestone have caught me and reeled me in all the way. I did say at the start that there will be spoilers up to and including chapter 100, so for the sake of principle, I will say this. The Swordmaster Akimura Soga and Yura possibly teaming up was not on my bingo card, and it does not seem fair. If you made it this far without having read chapter 100, then that is your own fault. Nevertheless, here is 2 100 chapters, and here's 2 100 more.